As a number of you aren't here every week, I think I ought to make my occasional announcement that that fanfare at the reading of the Gospel is not build-up for the preacher, but a welcome to the reading of God's Word. So I wouldn't want you to get the wrong impression. Anyway, in 1999, Sam and I took what was for us then the holiday of a lifetime. We didn't have much money. And we were fairly recently married and recent graduates from university. And what we did is we got in our old beat-up Peugeot 205, if you remember those, and we drove up to the west coast of Scotland. And the journey was amazing. We drove up the M6, we passed through the Lake District, and it was like you could just feel the tension in your shoulders beginning to subside. We had an amazing time. We climbed Ben Nevis. It was snowy from 1,000 meters up to the summit. It was just idyllic. And then for the second part of our holiday, we had a couple of nights in a B&B on the island of Mull, overlooking the holy island of Iona. Now, I don't know if you know Iona, but it is just this stunning place. It was Easter. There was snow on the tops of the mountains around that we could see. But when you walked onto the beach on Iona, on the very north tip, it was like the photographs we'd seen of the Caribbean. The sea was unbelievably clear. The sand was this kind of white, golden color. It was just magnificent. It was freezing cold, but to look at, it was wonderful. And we sort of walked almost the whole way around Iona. We had our map. We were dutifully following it. And then we realized that the ferry that was due to take us back, it's not very far from Iona to Mull, but nonetheless, you wouldn't want to have to swim it. And the ferry was going to be going quite soon. We needed to get a move on. Well, the path on the map went quite a long way. And it looked to me as though if we just walked over to the hill right by us, we could take a shortcut and make our way down to the ferry and get back to our nice warm B&B and have a lovely warm cup of tea. Well, you can imagine what happened, can't you? We walked up the hill. It was magnificent. The view from the top, you could see down over the sound and back onto Mull. It was great. It looked like there was a straight way down to where we needed to go. The plan was coming together until we hit the bog. And we realized, well, we couldn't get through that. So we then had to kind of cut sideways and climb over a wall. And then we found ourselves being menaced by some remarkably aggressive sheep. It all went horribly wrong. And actually, we began to feel like we were in some danger. We managed to get through, much delayed. And we had to wait. There was a later sailing, thankfully, of the ferry. And we caught that. But it's a thing that Tolkien said, isn't it? That shortcuts make for long delays. It looked like a straight and easy journey, but actually it turned out to be fraught with difficulty and even danger, if you think sheep are dangerous. I don't. Other members of the family disagree. If you try to travel without the map, you easily get lost. If you just try to follow your nose and go the way that you think will work, you may well find that it doesn't work out for you quite the way you expected. That, I think, is what Psalm 1 is about. Now, on first sight, and hopefully you've all got a copy of it in front of you. I've printed out enough, I think, for everyone. On first look, Psalm 1 looks like simple moralizing. Blessed is the one who doesn't do what wicked people do, but does what righteous people do. If you do what righteous people do, it'll work out well for you. If you do what wicked people do, well, it's going to be really bad. But take a closer look. All the verbs in verse 1 are very active, aren't they? Blessed is the one who doesn't walk in step with the wicked, or stand in the way that sinners take, or sit in the company of mockers. Blessed is the one who doesn't live their life according to the evil ways of people around them. Don't get in with bad company. Maybe that's what it's saying. Don't allow yourself to be led astray. Don't become one of them. But then when you look at verse 2, what becomes apparent to me is what we're not given is an equal and opposite way of living. I sort of expect when I look at verse 2 that there's going to be, but who walks in step with the righteous, who stands in the company of the righteous, who sits down to eat with the righteous. But it doesn't say that, does it? Actually, it's just a totally different sort of person who's being described. Blessed is the one who doesn't walk in step with the wicked or stand in the way that sinners take or sit in the company of mockers, but whose delight is in the law of the Lord and who meditates on his law day and night. Suddenly, we're not dealing with the sort of kind of active doing kind of verbs of walking and standing and sitting. We're in the realm of loving and thinking, delighting in the law of the Lord, meditating on his law. It's not an equal and opposite reaction. It's something very different. It's about affections, about motivations, about the way you think, about what leads and guides your mind and your heart. It's very striking to me. It's not simply, don't be one of the bad people, be one of the good people. And yet that's so often how we think God speaks to us in his word, that what he's saying to us is, don't do bad things, do good things, and everything will be fine. But it doesn't say that. It does say, don't go along with wicked people, don't live lives that are full of sin, but the alternative to that is not just do what's right. It's something quite different. Now, why is that, do you think? Well, I think we all think we know what's right, don't we? We've all got consciences. We've all got a sense of what ought and ought not to be done. And so we think, well, if only we just follow our conscience, if only we do what is so obviously right to us and to the world around us, then we'll be on the side of the goodies rather than on the side of the baddies. But Psalm 1, which is like the entryway to the Psalms, to these books of poetical reflection on all of life, in all of its ups and all of its downs, in the light of God's goodness, doesn't invite us simply to be a goodie rather than a baddie. It invites us to look at the world in quite a different way entirely. Now, when you actually think about what we consider to be right and wrong, actually perhaps that begins to make some sense. Because maybe we're not as sure as we think we are. We're aware, aren't we, of some terrible, shameful things about our nation's past. Much wealth in this country was built on the back of slaves, people who were taken into ownership by other people simply on the basis of their race and exploited to make people in this country and in the United States of America in particular wealthy. Now, I cannot imagine that there is a person in this room this morning who does not think that is shameful, who does not think that in some way something should be done to make sure that we no longer live with the values of that time. No one in this room would argue that race slavery is a good thing, would they? Surely not. And yet, for 100 years, a nation lived with a clean conscience about that shameful thing. No one questioned it, or at least not to start with, or at least not in public. Everyone just went along. That was no new thing with the sort of late British Empire. It's something that human beings have done to each other for thousands of years. It's not obvious to human beings necessarily that it's wrong. Aristotle, perhaps the greatest of the Greek philosophers, said that some people by their very nature show that they were born to be slaves. And yet we know, don't we? We know deep down in our marrow that that's not right. That every human being has value and dignity and must be treated as an equal. Now, we have learned lessons that earlier generations did not know or understand. And that's a great thing. But if you're a reflective sort of person, it raises a question, doesn't it? If people then could be so blind, if they could allow such obvious evil to flourish in their midst, what might I be missing today? What evil might I cherish in my heart, might I think is good, or at least allowable? What evil might I not recognize in my own heart or in the culture that I live in? In the sort of anniversary remembrances of 9/11, all kinds of documentaries and things have been put together. I've been listening to a podcast on Amazon called After the Fall. It's about the FBI investigation of those bombings. And there was a line that really stuck with me. One of the investigators early on in Afghanistan got to know some of the members of Al-Qaeda. And he said, the first thing you realize about these guys is that they think they're the good guys. They think they're on the side of right. Having been exposed to the horrors of National Socialism, the French philosopher Simone Weil said this: evil, when we're in its grip, does not seem like evil, but as a necessity, or even as a duty. What I think Psalm 1 invites us to do is to entertain the possibility that that is true. And that if we just follow our noses, if we try to find our way through life without a map, without someone outside showing us what is the right way, we can find ourselves bogged down in that terrible situation of treating evil as though it were a duty, of doing wickedness and thinking that we're doing good. We would say, wouldn't we, that people in other generations who have just followed the crowd, who have just gone along with what is accepted as good, as accepted as moral, have gone very wrong. I think we would agree, wouldn't we, that the people who plotted and eventually flew planes into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center were doing something terribly wrong. But they thought they were doing good as they did it. How can I avoid being swept along in just going with the flow of what is accepted but turns out to be evil in the eyes of God? Well, says the psalmist, welcome to the Psalms. It's not just don't do the bad things that bad people do. It's having your whole inner life transformed as God speaks to you. The one who ends up established, permanent, deep-rooted, fruitful, flourishing is the one who digs deep into God's communication with humanity. The one whose delight is in the law of the Lord, who listens to God speaking and cherishes that word who says, this is a map, this is a light for my feet, this will lead me through this strange world filled with shadows and dangers, whose delight is in the law of the Lord, and who meditates on his law day and night, who doesn't just read it as a duty and then goes away and forgets, but meditates on it, chews on it, lets it get deep into them and transform them into someone who sees things God's way. Because in the end, that's what brings real change to us as individuals, but also to our common life. William Wilberforce, whose wife actually came from this congregation, fought in this country, in Parliament, to end slavery. Why? Because God's word told him that every human being is made in the image of God, and so is valuable and has dignity and must be treated as a brother or a sister. And so Psalm 1 invites us to approach life in a new way, to let God's voice be the voice that guides, to let God's word be the map that shows us the way forward. And the promise is so enticing, isn't it? In a world of where everything is temporary and quickly blown away, the person who does that, who thoughtfully meditates on God's word, is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season, whose leaf does not wither. Whatever they do prospers. But if you just go with the flow, well, then you could find yourself with the other group, like chaff, described here as the wicked, like chaff that the wind blows away. Chaff, the unwanted part of the grain, the bit that's just blown away by the wind, dead and unloved. The wicked may stand in verse 1, but they will not stand, verse 5, in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. Because it is like two roads. There are two roads you can walk in life: the way of the righteous or the way of the wicked. One, the Lord watches over and guides. The map takes you home. But the other ends nowhere. So here's what I want to encourage you to do. Why not take an opportunity that's right in front of you? Each of you's got a copy of Psalm 1. Why not try something? Take it with you after the service. Don't just leave it on the pew. Take Psalm 1 away with you and try this week meditating on it, thinking deeply about what it has to say, asking, am I following a map that I can trust in the way that I build my life, in the way that I live my life, in the way that shows me the way forward? Try drinking deeply from this psalm this week and see what difference it makes.